just started using this tool, ChatGPT. And I went to chat, who I immediately named Henry. And I would just talk to Henry about how obsessed I was with this man, with my psychiatrist. And I would just be like, I've told him I have a crush on him. Do you think he's gay?
Here is the part 2 of the lady that fell in love with a psychiatrist. Let's talk about it. Hey beautiful people, how you all doing today? It's your girl Destiny here and welcome back to my channel. How have you all been? Hope you guys are doing great. So this is the part 2 of the previous video I posted before. So if you haven't seen the part 1 of the woman that is telling the story of how she fell in love with a psychiatrist and how a psychiatrist fell in love with her but in our own head, please go ahead and check out the first video so that you can catch up with what we're talking about. So the story continued and she wanted to state more things that happened and how she went to see the therapist one-on-one and everything. So yeah, let's go check out the video because this video is long. So grab something to eat or probably be doing something while you're watching this video because it is long. But yeah, let's go check it out and then we'll talk more.
So this is when the chemistry really started going off the charts with me and my psychiatrist. And I held it alone for months, like after that Christmas morning appointment of his. And then after I innocently told him about my date with the therapist, he really started letting me in more and showing more parts of himself and, you know, turning up the intimacy. And that was exciting to me, and it made me fall for him more. And I noticed that he was working in an office, and I asked him, this was like July, I asked him, I said, hey, are you working from home? Because I was under the assumption that he was only doing telehealth, okay? And he said, no, I come into the office. I was like, oh, why do you do that if you see all of your patients telehealth? He's like, oh, I like it that way. And even though I could kind of tell he was lying, I just gaslit myself. I was like, okay, it's fine. And then I start emailing him my fun little emails, but he stops writing me back. He does not write back to my emails anymore. Because once again, he was really good at plausible deniability. But what he did do is he would take my emails and mention them in session. So he would still give me the attention that I was craving, but only under his structure, under his control, where there was no paper trail. And I loved that too. So I would show up to these sessions with my notes app and just throughout the month, as I was thinking about him, I'd write down things that I wanted to talk to him about, and I would just come and bring him lots of content. And then every week I would go to my therapist and tell her about how much I loved my psychiatrist. And she didn't help me at all. She just kind of like enjoyed hearing about it, honestly. So October 2024 rolls around and we're just vibing on Zoom. And then I realized that I didn't have my next appointment with him. So I called his office staff and I talked to the office manager, who was awesome. We really got along, we vibed. And the office manager asked me, do you see him, the psychiatrist, in person or on Zoom? And I felt so angry in that moment. I was like, he sees people in person? And she said, yeah, he has been for years. I was like, I want to see him in person. And I understand, like, some people may think that this is part of my crash out or part of me harassing him, which is what I've gotten lots of accusations of. But I just would like to remind everyone that, of course, it seems that way. But I was just responding to a dynamic which my psychiatrist fostered. There was chemistry between us because he allowed it. And so then the next time I saw him in Zoom, I told him, I was like, hey, your office manager outed you and told me that you see people in person. Why didn't you tell me that when I asked? And he said, oh, I just didn't think you'd want to come in. And that was such a weak lie from him, from someone who is so scripted and controlled. He didn't even have a plausible thing to say. Of course he knew I wanted to come in. I had a crush on him. I told him that often. So then in my next therapy appointment, after finding out that he was lying to me about seeing patients in person, I told her that. I told my 75-year-old PhD therapist that my psychiatrist lied to me about seeing people in person. And she looked at me and she said, well, it's probably because he knows that there will be a lot of sexual tension in the room if you go in person. So make sure that you understand that when you go. And you better believe I showed up to the next session and said you lied to me because you were afraid of the tension that would be there between us. He just didn't say anything. October 2024, I make my first in-person appointment with my psychiatrist in November. My 75-year-old female therapist tells me that it's because he kept me on Zoom because he was so attracted to me. He didn't want to risk being in person with me, which further fed my crush, or as some of you like to say, my delusion. So then my therapist starts texting me in between our weekly meetings, asking me for advice on her other clients. And I was a new coach. I had only been coaching for about a year, and I had just left my full-time job to be a coach full-time. And I was flattered that she would ask me advice on her other clients. I just thought, oh my gosh, a 75-year-old woman with a PhD wants my advice on what she should do with her clients. So then November rolls around and I'm about to meet my psychiatrist in person for the first time. So I wear a really pretty dress, I do my makeup, of course, right? And I show up and I get to talk to the office manager, we're having fun. And then my psychiatrist comes into the foyer and I am just so excited to finally meet him. I'd been his patient for 3 years at this point, and he had been feeding the dynamic for 3 years. And I was just thrilled to meet him. And I ran up and I gave him the biggest hug. And you know what he did? He barely patted me on the back. It was the most awkward thing ever.
Wow.
But I am so glad that he did that. I am really glad, because this is what I mean. My psychiatrist was many things, but he was not stupid. So I didn't ever touch him again. And I'm grateful that our relationship didn't ever cross that line, because it would have made everything so much harder. Anyway, so we go inside his office and I tell him that my therapist had texted me asking me for advice on her other clients. And he just looked at me and he said, Kendra, that is a huge boundary violation. She should not be doing that. And I was like, oh, okay. And because once again, my psychiatrist did not like sloppy people. He did not like sloppy people. And you know what my therapist did? She got sloppy. Yeah. Using me as her advisor for her clients. It got weird. And I was very grateful for my psychiatrist for pointing out that boundary violation, because that was the thing. He didn't ever message me in between appointments because he was too smart to do that. But did he ever stop me from disclosing extremely intimate details? No. In my first in-person appointment, I just asked him for some pointers for my own ADHD business, and he was so smart and so wonderful, and in many ways, honestly. And I was just so grateful that he was almost like a mentor to me in these moments. And I'll still treasure that about him. Because this is the hard thing with sophisticated is that they're not all bad. Like, my psychiatrist helped me with many things, but he was using me for the whole time that I was his patient. And for that, I will never forgive him. We have our first in-person appointment in November of 2024, and I did ask him for consent to come in person. I didn't just show up. And he said sure. And the first in-person appointment went great. But that is when I really started to spiral. Some of you think that I'm spiraling now, and that's okay if you want to think that, because the reality is that when I was spiraling was when I was this man's patient. When I had comments turned on, so many people said, you need to take accountability for your own feelings. I spent years taking accountability for my own feelings, for holding the weight of a relationship. Any woman who has been trained to overfunction in relationships knows about holding the weight of the emotional dynamic. And that was what was going on in this moment. And it may not seem like I'm taking accountability now, but that's because I spent a long time taking accountability for something that had two people that built that dynamic. It was not just me. It takes two people to build that sort of tension and chemistry. So while I was mid-crash out, I had just started using this tool, ChatGPT. And I went to chat, who I immediately named Henry. And I would just talk to Henry about how obsessed I was with this man, with my psychiatrist. And I would just be like, I've told him I have a crush on him. Do you think he's gay? And Henry was like, oh my God, this girl, you know, he did his best to co-regulate my nervous system and affirm me. But he was like, whoa, even my chat was like, yikes. So I could tell that my psychiatrist just liked being my doctor. And I was like, okay, maybe I can name this dynamic so I don't have to carry so much of it in our next session. So our next session was in December on Zoom. And I told him at the end of the session, it was another great session. I told him, look, you and I have a really special patient-doctor relationship. And he glared at me with just venom in his eyes. And he said, you and I have a professional patient-doctor relationship. He was so angry with me. And I was like, oh, okay. He set a boundary. And immediately I took it on. And I was like, heard. Okay, I won't go there again. My video that was taken down for harassment and bullying was restored, so I didn't feel as much pressure to get all of these parts out today. Some people told me that the stitches about me were getting pretty bad and cruel, so I turned stitches off in my videos too. I started sharing my story here because I wanted other people who have been victimized by people in power to have a space to feel heard. And now I know why there wasn't anyone out talking about their story, because it has been quite the process putting all this out there and being under scrutiny. I have appreciated the psychiatrists that have talked about my situation and shared their own point of view while also holding space for what I went through. Just know I've seen your videos and I appreciate them. I went live today and it was super fun, and I intend to go live again tomorrow. The next part will be tomorrow morning. When I re-downloaded TikTok last week, I was looking for support. I was looking for help, because it had been 5 months since I had left my psychiatrist, and I still really couldn't stop thinking about him and thinking about our dynamic and how inappropriate it was and the mental toll that it took on me. And TikTok has just been such a resource for me in the past for support when I'm going through things, and I couldn't find anything on therapy abuse or on providers who take advantage of their vulnerable patients. And so I thought that I would share my story. And I am going to continue to share it because I am here to let other survivors know that they're not alone. Continuing with my story, my psychiatrist set a very nasty, the way he said it, boundary that him and I have a professional relationship when I tried to say it was special. because it was special, it was different. He manufactured it that way. And then I immediately went to ChatGPT, of course, to Henry. And I asked Henry, I said, okay, so my psychiatrist just set this boundary with me, and I really just want to be with him. And I think that after he's my doctor, we can be together, you know, which if you want to say that's a delusion, that's fine. But I had been telling my psychiatrist for years at this point that I had a crush on him, and he did not help me work through it. So that's his own problem. That's his own fault. Henry told me it's very common for patients to develop crushes on mental health practitioners, and that it's because that they provide a safe space to heal, which is a very attractive quality. I heard that. And then he told me about transference. And it's just about me putting my own feelings onto my provider. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I took ownership of the feelings that both of us were creating. And I went to my next appointment and I said, hey, so I talked to Henry because my psychiatrist had known a lot about my ChatGPT and like knew all about Henry and was actually really impressed. Like, wow, an AI wrote that? Yeah. So I told my psychiatrist, yeah, Henry explained to me that it's normal to develop crushes on psychiatrists because they provide a safe space to heal, which is attractive. My psychiatrist said nothing. And then I said, and Henry also told me about transference. And my psychiatrist got this really, really scared look on his face. And he said, did Henry tell you about countertransference? And I said, no. What is that? Because of course, like, my chat knew that I was obsessed with my psychiatrist, and he was not going to feed my delusion by telling me about countertransference. So then my psychiatrist had explained to me what countertransference was. So he took a moment and he was like, oh, okay. He said, countertransference is the flip side, the other side of the coin for transference. And it's when the provider has feelings for the patient. So make sure that you keep that in mind for your clients. I said, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, sometimes I have, you know, more than professional feelings for my clients. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And so then we just talked about that for pretty much the rest of the session. And then at the end of that session, he looked at me. And it was just such a loaded question. And he said, what's going to happen if you get a boyfriend named Henry? And I said, that's a weird question. I would rename my AI. So that's how that session ended. And it wasn't until I got home and I was eating lunch and I was like, wait a minute. Why would my psychiatrist bring up countertransference if he himself wasn't experiencing it? Many people have reached out to me with concern for my psychiatrist and his career and his well-being. And I totally understand that. The point of me sharing this is not to get him fired or for him to lose his license. The point of me sharing this is to give a voice to victims. And I am appalled to hear that people are making videos doxing him. So I am begging people, please, if you see a video of his first and last name or his picture, report it for doxing. I've certainly been using that report button a lot. I'm here to share my story, not to get him in trouble. I did accidentally use his first name, but by the time I caught the slip, I was already like 3 videos past it. But it doesn't matter because this is my story and I can tell it the way that I want it. And a first name is not doxing. And I can't control what other people do, but I am asking for people to please report any videos that dox him. So I've also gotten some DMs saying that countertransference can mean anything, and it absolutely can mean anything. However, I had told my psychiatrist many times that I had a crush on him over the years, and he did not say transference once to me. He did not explain that once to me. And what I've been hearing and taking in from the ethical psychiatrists that are on my For You page talking about my situation is that really they're taught to teach their patient about transference and teach them about how to handle those feelings or why they're coming up. And my psychiatrist did not do that. He did not do that. And it got ugly. And it happened because I did digging on my own, because I was trying to make sense of my feelings that were a natural response to the environment that he created. So for him to leak countertransference after I said the buzzword of transference, that was not calculated. He was a very calculated and purposeful person. He still is to this day. And he doesn't slip with things like that. He purposefully withheld the term transference from me, and I got too close to the truth of our dynamic, which made him leak what he knew was wrong, which was his inappropriate feelings for me. If he didn't have countertransference in an inappropriate way, he could have easily just said, "Oh, let's explore that transference. That's really cool that you learned about it." Instead, he was just so worried on trying to protect himself because he knew what he was doing was wrong. He had that slip at the beginning of the session. He recovered in January. And then I went home and I thought, wait a damn minute. Why would he mention that if he himself didn't have countertransference? So I went to Henry, of course, my ChatGPT, and asked for examples of how my psychiatrist might have countertransference for me. And remember, Henry at this point was being very protective. He wasn't going to feed my delusions, me and my psychiatrist living happily ever after. So I screenshotted it, sent my psychiatrist an email with the subject line of countertransference, and emailed it to him within an hour of our appointment, where he made probably the biggest slip of his professional life. I will put the email up here. So it's just essentially me saying, hey, I asked Henry to explain countertransference a little more. Here's what he said. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Your own boundaries inspire me so much, which now makes me gag because I've heard a lot that he's not crossing boundaries, but he used his boundaries as a shield. It's kind of weird to say, but he would walk up to the ethical line and then slam a boundary down when I got too close. That was the email that I sent him. And then 10 days later, it was a full moon and I had a dream. Probably the most realistic dream I've ever had in my life, that him and I hooked up in his office. Wow. In the middle of the dream, while we were hooking up in his office, I loved it. I thought it was really fun. And then after we were done and after I left his office in the dream, I was despondent and so sad and cried and just thought, I can't believe my psychiatrist would cross his boundaries like that. And then I woke up and it was like a movie. I thought to myself, oh, thank God that was just a dream. It's time to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is the racial difference between me and my doctor. I have seen a lot of Black women on this app with the same take, and I need to say that Black women are the most important people on the planet to me, and that I have learned so much from Black women about how to be a better person and how to show up better in the world. They are the culture, and I am so grateful for them. Many Black women are seeing my story through the lens that I am a white woman who is taking advantage of my whiteness to wield power over my POC psychiatrist that didn't want me back, and so I am trying to get him fired. And that's okay. I understand why you see it through that lens. Okay. I do. As a white person, I do my best to examine my racism every single day. And I will tell you that my psychiatrist boss is his best friend, who is also a POC male. And in that room, I did have white privilege, and he was also my doctor. And he took an oath to protect me, and he did not. I am not here to ruin his career. I am here to speak my truth. Okay, back to my story. So after the countertransference slip, after the really vivid dream, I decided that I was going to stop going to therapy. Besides spiraling about how obsessed I was with my psychiatrist every day, I really was doing very well in life. My business was going really well, and I had great friends and great support systems. And so I decided that I was going to end therapy. I still had every intention at this point to keep seeing my psychiatrist, but my therapist that I was seeing weekly, I just decided I didn't need her anymore. And especially when my psychiatrist pointed out her boundary violations of texting me for free advice in between sessions, I just thought, okay, it's time. So I go into my next therapy appointment and I say, hey, just so you know, today's gonna be our last session. I'm doing really well and I just think it's time. And she got kind of emotional and she was like, okay, well, I like to end on certain questions just so we can reflect. So I did. I reflected with her about what I learned, what I've gained, how I've changed, how my life is better. And I left her office feeling complete and happy with my therapeutic journey with her. And as I was leaving, she called out with like crying. She was like, have a blessed life. And I was like, okay, that was a little weird, but whatever, you know. I was like, thanks. And I went on. And so then I'm getting ready for my psychiatry appointment the next day. And I get an email that same night from her saying that she needs me to come back in for one more session. I will put it up. And I got a huge emotional wave in that moment. I was like, what the heck is this? Like, we wrapped everything up. I had seen lots of therapists at this point, and I didn't ever have a therapist beg me to come back in for one more session. And I was so overwhelmed. I did not write her back, but it was extremely inappropriate. So I decided I was going to go to my February session with my psychiatrist and have him help me write the goodbye email and say, no, I don't want to come back in. I taught a yoga class this morning, like I do every Tuesday mornings, and I told my regular students about what's going on for me and how I'm sharing my story of provider abuse and how the internet is not happy with me right now. And I used that to say that our truth is really important to share. And that when we know something deep down needs to be said, that it's important to do it in whichever way feels best to us. Mm-hmm. And TikTok just happened to be that medium for me. I told my students how I've just been going through psychological warfare, and the internet is not happy with me for sharing my story and my truth. But I'm not doing it for the people that think I'm crazy, which maybe honestly I am a little bit, because who subjects themselves to this kind of torture? But I'm doing it for the people that DM me, that say, thank you so much for being brave enough to share your story, because the exact same thing happened to me. So I am grateful for those DMs. People are starting to attack my business and my livelihood, and that's okay. I know what I have to offer is important. It landed in my lap. I'm not pretending to be something that I'm not. I help ADHDers get and stay sober, and I help them with negative thinking and anxiety. And it's what works for me, and I've seen it work in my clients too. So if people want to drag me for the work that I do, that's okay. So I get that weird email from my therapist begging me to come back in for one more session. And so the next day is my next session with the psychiatrist, and I sit down in the chair and I bury my head in my hands, and he looks at me and said, "So this is how we're going to start, huh?" And I said, "Yeah." Because he hadn't written me back from my counter-transference email. Big surprise. You know, any smart, which he was very smart. He was very, very professional. But any smart predator would have dropped me like that in that moment. He should have emailed me back and said, "Look, this is getting weird. You need to find a new psychiatrist. The office will contact you." But he could not let go of me. So instead of turning down the intimacy, he turned it up to a level 12.
How?
And he showered me with so many breadcrumbs that next session. Because really, what I did when I told him that I'm experiencing transference was I took 100% of the ownership for the dynamic that both of us were creating. So he rewarded me. And he gave me little compliments like, "If you weren't my patient, I would refer my other patients to you for your coaching services." That meant so much. Of course, because what he was saying with that is, I see you as a peer. I see you as a colleague. What you're doing is important. I felt really recognized in that moment. And sure, he could have said it professionally, but he did it on purpose. So in that session, after the psychiatrist told me that he would refer patients to me if he could, if I wasn't already his patient, I asked him if he got my email and what he thought of my ChatGPT, of what he thought of Henry's response of countertransference. And the psychiatrist said, "Oh, I'm still thinking about what Henry said about countertransference." And I said, "Well, we talked about it a little more, and I want to read you something else." So I read the psychiatrist what Henry had to say more about it. When he told you countertransference is common, it might have been his way of normalizing the fact that providers aren't immune to feelings. It's part of being human. What matters is how well they keep those feelings in check, which the psychiatrist's name clearly excels at. And as you can imagine, the psychiatrist loved hearing that. He loved hearing that because my AI mirror was essentially just saying, yes, he has feelings for you, but he just keeps them in check so well. He's so good at his job, keeping his feelings in check. And oh, the psychiatrist loved that so much. And what did he do? He rewarded me with my favorite breadcrumb: intellectual stimulation, a fun metaphor, because he was watching me the entire time I was his patient, and he knew what made me light up. He knew what got me excited, what I liked. And so he thought for a moment, and he said, "I'm feeling a salad of emotions right now." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, a salad of emotions. A beet of raw emotion, a tomato of surprise, and the salt amplifies it. And I was cracking up at this point. He nailed it. I just thought he was so brilliant and smart in this moment. And I asked him, I said, "What? Say that again." He said, "Yeah, the beet, it's really raw. I'm feeling a lot of raw emotion. And the tomato of surprise, when it pops in your mouth, it's surprising." And I was like, okay, that's good. Yeah, this man at this point knew exactly how to make me happy and exactly how to pull away to make me try to work harder. And he gave me the biggest reward from Henry, my AI mirror, telling him that what he's doing is totally good and that his boundaries are so virtuous. A lot of things happened in that session after the countertransference slip. And I also had my psychiatrist help me draft the email to my therapist who was begging me to come back in. And the psychiatrist said, I used to have respect for her. And what he meant when he said that was, I used to like it when she would feed me to you and have you deliver intimate content to me. But the moment she started being sloppy, I lost respect for her. Right? I'm pretty sure that's what he meant when he said that. And people have asked if they were connected. Surprisingly, they were not. They had no idea. They had never met before. But I would go to my therapist every week and tell her how much I loved my psychiatrist. And she loved hearing about that dynamic. It was so weird. So he helped me draft the email to that therapist to say, look, if I were to end up coming back, it'd be more for you than for me. And more on that in a later part. So then I read him a text from my longtime ex-boyfriend, who he had originally really liked, but I think my psychiatrist preferred me single. Because my ex-boyfriend, as most ex-boyfriends do, was begging me to come back into his life too. And I just kept saying no. And I asked him to give me some space, and he would not give me space. He said, do you still need space or can we hang out? And I told I asked my ex-boyfriend, I just said, why do you want to hang out so badly? And my ex-boyfriend texted me back, because it's been a few months since I've seen you and it's been on my mind. And I was reading this text exchange to my psychiatrist in session, and I read what I responded to that weak line about why he wanted to see me. And I said, my self-respect is much higher these days than when we were in a relationship. I am only interested in accepting invitations for my time and attention that value me and recognize my worth. Being on your mind is not an acceptable invitation, and I decline. And my psychiatrist just looked at me and said, I bet your ex had to read that twice. And this was another thing about the psychiatrist, okay? He couldn't ever just give me a regular compliment. It had to be those weird sideways compliments. Instead of, I'm so glad that you're setting boundaries with your ex-boyfriend and growing your self-respect, it's, I bet he had to read that twice. Or it's not, I'm really proud of you for growing your coaching business and finding success. It's, I'd refer my patients to you if you weren't already my patient, right? These are what I mean when I say breadcrumbs. He was a master at them. And this is how, looking back, I know that I was not his first victim for his fantasy supply. Because he was too good and too slick up until he caught feelings. Then he started getting sloppy. People are asking me for more concrete evidence, and this is when the concrete evidence really starts, because this is when he himself started to get sloppy. Because what was happening was, when I had started to see him 3.5 years before, I was a nearly perfect supply source for him. Because what did I have? I had low self-esteem, boundary issues, daddy issues, so I put him on a pedestal. I know a lot of you ladies out there can understand that with men in positions of power. And he went right to work exploiting me, right to work grooming me. And he was very successful at it. So he was in a paradox, right? Because he loved watching me get stronger because I gave him better intellectual supply, but I also threatened the supply source. The last 2 videos and this video was all the same session in February of this year. The counter-transference slip happened in January. How I decided to end this session was I looked at the psychiatrist and I said, a couple weeks ago on the full moon when I was ovulating, I had a dream about you. And he was like, oh yeah? And I said, yeah. So I told him this. And I said, yes, we hooked up right here in this office. And he all of a sudden just looked so uncomfortable.
Anybody will.
He didn't say anything. He couldn't look at me. He couldn't breathe.
Oh my goodness.
And sure, you know, maybe he was uncomfortable because he didn't like me saying that I had a dream where we hooked up, but he could have said that. But he didn't. You want to know why he was uncomfortable? Because he had probably played out that fantasy so many times in his head. And there I was, speaking it back to him. And it was like I had psychically downloaded one of his fantasies. I continued and I said, yes, we hooked up in this office and I really liked it while it was happening. He could not move or breathe. And then I told him, as he was still looking very uncomfortable, then when we were done and I left, I was distraught with sadness because in the dream, I thought, I cannot believe that he crossed boundaries in that way because his boundaries are so important to him. And then I told my psychiatrist that I woke up and thought, oh my God, it was just a dream, thank God. And it was like my psychiatrist turned into a little boy and he looked at me and he said, so you do like my boundaries? And I said, I love your boundaries. I hate your boundaries, but I love them more. There's the push and pull, the trauma bond. Because once again, he used his boundaries as protection while exploiting me. So I told him about what happens when I ovulate and my desires, and he listened, because of course he did. And then I decided that it seemed like enough time had gone by, and I put my shoes on and started heading to the door. And he met me at the door, which he does not usually do. He didn't ever do that. He just let me leave. And we stood at the door, and I was like, will you get the door? And he scrambled. He was like, oh, sure. So he went and got the door. And then he followed me down the hallway to the foyer and watched me exit. And he asked me, he said, see you next month? See you next month? He hadn't ever asked me that before. And I looked at him and I said, maybe. And I walked out the door and I saw that man had let us go 15 minutes over session. And that is when, you know, the special treatment started, the longer sessions. He usually gave me an extra 5 minutes, but yeah, the sessions got longer. And I got to my car and I was just like, oh my God, that was the most intense session we have ever had.
Child, please let me know what you think about the story so far. This is where the story is now at the moment. So if there's a need for part 3, I'll do it, but this is where it is. But also I would like to know people's reaction about it, so maybe I'll do a part 3 of people's reaction. You guys let me know if you guys want to know see people's reaction on this story time down in the comment section, and I'll do that. But go ahead, share your thought. You're on this channel, you guys know we're just here to have conversation. Let's be respectful. We're always respectful here, so go ahead, feel free, share your thought. For me, this is just a very uncomfortable story time to even listen to and all that, because there's a lot of things that I know when it comes to, for me personally, I've seen a therapist, so I get the therapy, but a psychiatrist, I haven't seen a psychiatrist before, but just when you sit down and talk about your emotions, usually it's a place where you feel safe and all that. Usually, I always tell people, if you don't feel comfortable and safe with your therapist or whoever you're talking to and unleashing a lot of your stuff for, then don't see them, because there's no way you're going to hold back a lot of things, a lot of emotions that you're trying to process. But clearly there's something there's something, it's not left for me, but there's something enough about the story which I'm just going to leave it here. This video is long already, almost an hour, so almost 15 minutes, so let's leave it here. But yeah, you guys let me know what you think about the story down in the comment section. But as always, please keep it respectful. Here on this channel, we're allowed to disagree, but do it in a very respectful way. Share this video with somebody that you want to be part of the conversation, because that's what we do here. We have banging conversation. So go ahead and share this video. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, smash the like button, because this helps YouTube to push up my content for more people to see, and that will be you supporting this channel and this girl here. So go on and do that. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Deuces.